The morning started like any other, quiet and steady, with a soft wind moving across the open fields. The rancher had woken before the sun, as he always did, thinking the day would hold nothing more unusual than feeding the cattle and checking the fences. He walked toward the barn with a half-awake calm, expecting the familiar rhythm of hooves shifting in their stalls. But before he even reached the doors, something felt off. There was a stillness in the air that didn't match the hour, and the horses inside weren't making their usual morning sounds. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, the kind that told a man something had changed. He unlatched the barn door and stepped inside, letting the thin light spill across the dusty floor. The horses he knew so well lifted their heads in quiet recognition. Then he saw it. A shape he did not expect. A horse he had never seen before stood in the far stall, larger than the others and carrying a calm but alert posture. Its coat had a strange shine, almost like it had been brushed with care right before sunrise. It wasn't the sort of animal someone would leave anywhere without reason. It wasn't scared, either. It looked at him steadily, almost as if it had been waiting. He moved slowly, trying not to startle it as he took in every detail. The horse was strong, well-fed, and clearly trained. No brand, no familiar marks, nothing that connected it to anyone he knew. On this ranch, nothing ever showed up without someone sending word first. Folks around these parts respected boundaries. They didn't leave animals without a reason, especially not one as fine as this one. His thoughts began to pick up speed as he realized how unusual this really was. A stranger's horse in his barn was the kind of mystery that rarely turned out simple. Then he noticed the stall door wasn't locked the way he had left it the night before. It had been slid closed but not latched. And hanging on the inside, tucked into the small metal loop, was a folded note. His heartbeat shifted. Notes weren't common here. People talked face to face, not through scraps of paper left behind in the dark. He reached for it, but his hand hovered there for a moment as he wondered what kind of message someone would leave with an unfamiliar horse. As he unfolded the paper, he could tell it had been handled more than once, the edges worn slightly as if the writer didn't know whether to leave it or keep it. The handwriting was steady but hurried, the kind of writing from someone who didn't want to stay long. The words hit him harder than he expected. They weren't threatening, but they carried a weight that felt personal. The note spoke of danger, of someone needing the horse kept safe, and of a reason the writer couldn't explain yet. It wasn't long, but it was enough to unsettle the rancher in a way he hadn't felt in years. He read it twice, trying to understand what kind of situation could lead to something like this. The horse stepped once in the stall, a soft thud of hoof on wood, almost like it sensed his confusion. He reached out to it gently, and it lowered its head, allowing his hand to brush its neck. It was calm, too calm for a horse left behind by someone running from trouble. Or maybe it had been trained for situations just like this. The rancher looked around the barn, searching for any other clue, but everything else was untouched. No footprints in the dust except the ones belonging to him and his usual animals. Whoever had brought the horse had done so with surprising care, leaving no sign of entry. That detail alone tightened the unease in his chest. People didn't just walk onto someone's ranch unnoticed. Not unless they knew how to move quietly, or they knew the land well enough to slip through without disturbing anything. He stepped back outside and scanned the horizon. The sun was climbing higher now, spreading light across the fields, but nothing looked out of place. The cattle grazed the way they always did. The fence line stood straight. The wind rolled through the grass with its usual calm. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt normal at all. It was the strange contrast that made his thoughts churn deeper. His ranch had always been a steady place, a place where problems could be seen coming long before they arrived. But this wasn't the kind of problem that showed its face from a distance. This was the kind that slipped into the quiet hours and left unanswered questions behind. A horse in his barn. A note that hinted at danger. And no name, no explanation, no promise of return. He folded the note again, tighter this time, and slipped it into his pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than paper. He kept thinking about who could have done this. There were a few folks who might trust him enough to leave something important in his care, but none of them had reason to hide. None of them would bring trouble to his property without warning him first. And if someone had done this without knowing him, that raised even more questions. When he returned to the stall, the horse watched him with steady eyes. There was something in those eyes that made him believe this wasn't a random drop-off. Whoever owned this animal knew it would be safe here, or at least safer than wherever it had been. That meant the owner was either someone from his past or someone who knew his reputation, maybe both. The thought made the air feel heavier. He checked the horse over carefully, looking for injuries or signs of struggle, but found none. Whatever trouble the note mentioned hadn't reached the horse, at least not physically. But the message hinted at urgency. Something had pushed the owner to act quickly. The rancher wondered if they were still nearby, watching from a distance to make sure the horse was found. The idea made him glance around again, studying the edges of the property with a sharper eye. He could feel the story beginning to pull him in, piece by piece. The kind of story that didn't unfold all at once but revealed itself slowly through choices and moments. He wasn't sure he wanted any part of it, but the horse was here now, and the note had placed responsibility firmly in his hands. He had never been the kind of man to ignore a call for help, even when it came in the strangest form. Still, he knew enough about life to understand that accepting this responsibility might drag him into something larger than he was prepared for. And yet, something deeper inside him stirred with curiosity, the same instinct that had pushed him through difficult moments in the past. He wanted answers, not just for himself, but for whoever had trusted him enough to leave this horse behind. He stepped out of the barn again and took in the fields, the distant line of trees, the long stretch of open land that surrounded his home. Everything looked peaceful, but he knew that appearances could hide problems larger than the land itself. He felt the first hint of a choice forming in his mind. He could ignore the note, turn the horse over to the sheriff, and pretend none of this had ever landed on his doorstep. Or he could follow the clues, however few they were, and uncover the truth behind why this animal had come to him. The longer he stood there, the more he felt the pull of the second option. The mystery wasn't going to solve itself, and ignoring it would only leave him wondering. He wasn't a man who liked unfinished stories, and this one had already stepped into his life without his permission. He turned back toward the barn once more, the weight of the note still pressing against his pocket. The horse shifted slightly, as if sensing that something important had begun. The rancher didn't know where this path would lead or what danger the note had warned him about, but he knew one thing for certain. His quiet days were over, and whatever came next would test him in ways he hadn't faced in years. The mystery was now part of his world, and whether he liked it or not, there was no turning back. He stood in the barn doorway longer than he meant to, trying to make sense of everything that had changed in just a few minutes. The horse shifted again, brushing the wooden stall rail with a soft thump, as if reminding him this was no dream. The note in his pocket felt heavier now that he had time to think about what it meant. Someone out there was in trouble, someone who knew exactly where to drop a horse without being seen. It bothered him how quiet the arrival must have been. He had always believed he knew every sound that passed through his land. He had trusted that silence was nothing more than silence. Now he wondered what else he might have missed without realizing. He walked toward the feed storage to give his mind a moment to settle. Years of working the ranch had taught him that thinking too fast rarely brought clarity. He scooped grain into a bucket and carried it to the unfamiliar horse. The animal took a gentle step forward, accepting the feed without hesitation. It made him feel something he couldn't quite put words to. Trust, maybe. Or maybe the horse had simply been around enough people to know when someone meant no harm. As the animal ate, the rancher studied every inch again. The coat was a light gray, smooth and clean. The mane looked brushed recently. Its eyes carried a calm depth, the kind he had seen in horses that had been trained with patience instead of force. Whoever owned this horse had cared for it well. That detail didn't match someone who would abandon it unless the situation was serious. He leaned against the stall door, breathing in the smell of hay and dust, scents he had known all his life. The barn usually grounded him, but this time the familiar smells only reminded him how unfamiliar the situation was. He tried to picture who might have come to his land late at night. Only a few people from his past knew his routines well enough to slip in unnoticed. And most of those people had drifted away over the years. Some moved to distant towns, some chose new paths. A few had gotten into trouble of their own, though not the kind that would involve leaving a well-trained horse behind. He thought back to the note again. The handwriting seemed familiar in a way he couldn't pinpoint. There was a slight curve in the letters, a style he had seen somewhere before. But memory was tricky, especially when years passed and faces changed along with the way they wrote. He didn't want to assume anything, yet something inside him nagged at the idea of seeing writing like this once during a time he preferred not to revisit. The horse lifted its head and looked at him with an expression that almost felt purposeful. He knew it was foolish to read too much into an animal's gaze, but the feeling stayed. This wasn't just a horse, it was a message, a request, a warning. Maybe all three at once. He stepped back into the daylight and walked toward the house. He needed to sit and think, maybe read the note again when his mind wasn't racing. On the way, he stopped near the old fence that divided the pasture. It had stood there longer than most of the buildings. He leaned a hand on the top rail, letting the stillness settle over him. He remembered times when outsiders had come near the ranch, drifting through with their stories and secrets. He had helped a few of them when they needed it, offered food or a place to rest. But none had returned in a way that felt connected to this situation, and none had ever owned a horse quite like the one in his barn. He walked the perimeter later that morning, checking for tracks he might have missed. The grass near the barn entrance showed a few bent blades, but nothing fresh enough to trace. The dirt held no clear impressions either. Whoever had come knew how to hide their steps or worked under conditions that erased them quickly. He paused near a row of trees, listening. The wind rustled through the branches in its usual calm, offering no hints. He watched the long stretch of land beyond, wondering if the person who left the horse was out there somewhere, watching from a distance. He returned to the house and unfolded the note again at his kitchen table. The paper looked ordinary, but the words still carried a heavy pull. The message didn't say who wrote it. It didn't say when they would come back. It didn't explain what danger they meant. It only asked for the horse to be kept safe and mentioned that trouble was close. The rancher stared at the lines, reading them slowly this time, as if the meaning might shift if he gave it enough patience. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat quietly while the steam rose. Old memories began to drift into his thoughts. He thought of someone he once knew who had a way of showing up unpredictably, someone who never stayed in one place long. They had shared a few rough times together, moments filled with tension and uncertainty. He hadn't seen that person in years, and even thinking about them now stirred something uneasy in his chest. If the horse belonged to them, then whatever trouble they mentioned in the note might have been following them for some time. But he pushed the guess aside. It was too easy to fall into old assumptions. Too easy to make a situation fit a memory instead of looking at it with fresh eyes. What he needed was more evidence, more pieces of the story. And none of that was going to arrive if he sat inside waiting for answers. He stepped outside again, taking a slow walk toward the barn. The quiet of the land began to feel different as the hours passed. What normally brought comfort now held a trace of anticipation. The air felt thicker, as though the day itself knew something had shifted. When he reached the barn, the horse looked up at him in a way that felt almost knowing. He opened the stall and let the animal step out so he could lead it around the yard. The horse followed without resistance, walking with a steady rhythm that suggested confidence rather than fear. He walked it near the corral and watched the way it moved. Its gait was smooth and controlled, showing clear training. It wasn't a horse meant for simple pasture work. It was the kind used for long rides, difficult routes, or important tasks. That detail deepened the mystery. Someone trusted him with a valuable animal, and he needed to find out why. He brushed the horse afterward, hoping to spot any clues under the coat. A small piece of worn leather hung from the halter, as if a tag had once been attached but removed in haste. He touched the edge, running his thumb over the rough texture. It didn't tell him much, but it confirmed the owner had wanted the horse to arrive without identification. The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about danger. It was about secrecy. Whoever left the horse didn't want to be found yet. They needed time, space, or safety they could not reach on their own. And for reasons still hidden, they believed he was the one person who could protect what mattered to them. That belief carried weight he didn't expect. It made him wonder what he had done in his past that had earned such trust, or what decision he had made long ago that was now returning to shape his future. As the day pushed toward afternoon, he kept working around the ranch, but his mind never left the note or the horse. He fixed a loose hinge on the west gate, trimmed a few broken branches near the walkway, and collected tools he had left scattered the day before. Every task felt slightly out of step, as though his hands were busy, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He paused near the water trough and let the breeze drift over him. The land looked peaceful, but he knew peace could be broken without warning. He had seen it happen before. People often assumed quiet places stayed quiet forever, but life had a way of bringing storms even to the calmest corners. He returned to the barn one more time before sunset. The horse waited with the same patient look, standing tall and steady. The rancher rested a hand on its neck, feeling the warmth beneath the coat. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he did know this was only the beginning. The note, the silence, the unknown danger, the familiar handwriting that tugged at old memories, all of it pointed toward something bigger than a single morning surprise. He closed the barn doors slowly, aware that once night returned, someone might come back. Or maybe no one would come at all. But either way, the mystery had already taken hold, settling into the ranch like a shadow stretching with the fading light. And he felt, with a certainty he could not explain, that the truth would not stay hidden for long. He barely slept that night. Every few hours he found himself awake, listening for footsteps, hooves, or even the shift of wind that might carry a sign of whoever had left the horse behind. The quiet felt heavier than usual, almost expectant, as if the land itself was holding its breath. When dawn finally came, he got up before the sunlight reached the horizon and headed straight to the barn. The horse stood calm and alert, as if it had been waiting for him. He checked its water and feed, then leaned against the stall door with a long breath. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt changed. He kept thinking about the note tucked into his jacket. He had read it enough times to remember each word, but somehow it felt like the message carried more than what was written. The line about danger lingered the most. He wondered what kind of danger forced someone to leave their horse in the middle of the night. Not ordinary trouble. Not the kind that came from simple disagreements or financial hardships. Something more serious had driven this decision. While he worked through his chores that morning, he kept glancing toward the road leading into the ranch. He expected a rider to appear at any moment. Someone ready to explain everything. Someone ready to claim the horse. But the road stayed empty. The only thing that moved was the dust carried by the breeze. The lack of answers tugged at him in ways he didn't like. Over the years he had learned to solve most problems with instinct, patience, or plain hard work. But this situation required a different kind of thinking. A kind that came with remembering things he had set aside a long time ago. He tried to push those memories away, but they returned anyway. There had been a time in his life when he crossed paths with someone who always seemed to attract trouble, someone who moved from town to town leaving stories behind. They had shared dangerous moments together, moments he rarely talked about. That person had once trusted him with a secret they claimed could change everything. He never told anyone about it, and eventually they parted ways. But if the horse belonged to them, then whatever secret they carried might have resurfaced. He shook off the thought and focused on the tasks ahead. He repaired fences, checked the water lines, and sorted out feed sacks in the storage shed. Routine tasks usually cleared his mind, but today they only created more questions. Every step he took reminded him that someone out there trusted him with something important, and trust like that never came without a price. Later that afternoon, he saddled his old Murray and rode toward the far edge of the property. If someone had come through the night before, they might have left tracks deeper in the land where the ground wasn't so dry. As he rode along the tree line, he kept scanning for signs: a broken twig, a shift in the soil, a disturbed patch of grass. Anything that could trace the path of the visitor? After an hour, he found a faint trail near a cluster of low shrubs, hoofprints, not his mares, not any of his horses. These prints belonged to a horse with a slightly larger stride, likely the one now in his barn. The tracks moved along the edge of the property, then faded toward the south, turning into an open field before disappearing on harder ground. Whoever brought the horse had traveled a route that kept them hidden as long as possible. Someone careful. Someone experienced. He followed the trail until it vanished completely, then sat in the saddle wondering why the stranger had stopped at his barn. Out of all the ranches in the region, why his? The answer could be simple, but simple explanations rarely came attached to cryptic notes and a valuable horse. On his way back, he saw a cloud of dust rising from the road in the distance. He tensed, wondering if someone unfamiliar was heading toward his home. But when the figure finally rode into view, he recognized one of the nearby ranch hands from a neighboring property. They exchanged a casual greeting, though the visitor looked more curious than usual. They spoke briefly about weather, land, and the slow season affecting ranch work. Then the man asked if he had heard anything strange last night. The rancher paused before answering, choosing his words with care. He said it had been quiet, nothing unusual, though his voice didn't feel as steady as he hoped. The visitor nodded, mentioning that his dogs had been restless. They kept barking toward the ridge as if someone passed through. That single detail tightened something inside the rancher. It meant the stranger who left the horse had moved carefully, but not without leaving ripples across the land. Someone else had felt it too. Once the man rode off, the rancher returned home with a deeper sense of unease. The pieces were coming together in ways that concerned him. The trail, the note, the nervous dogs, the sudden arrival of a horse with no explanation. There was a pattern forming, something building beneath the surface. That evening he sat on the porch while the sun dipped behind the hills. He watched long shadows stretch across the yard. The horse in the barn occasionally made soft noises, reminders that the mystery inside those wooden walls was becoming part of his daily life. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers, but answers didn't come from sitting alone. So he decided to ride into town the next morning. Maybe someone had seen a stranger passing through. Maybe someone mentioned a horse gone missing. Information traveled fast in small places, especially when anything unusual happened. The next day he saddled his mare and rode along the dusty road toward town. The wind carried a cool bite and he kept his jacket pulled tight. As he approached the small cluster of buildings, he saw familiar faces and heard the usual mix of friendly calls. He tied his mare near the general store and stepped inside. People talked as they always did, about crops, about cattle prices, about someone's wagon wheel breaking at the old bridge. But no one mentioned strangers on the road or unfamiliar horses. He bought a few supplies, then made his way to the feed store where gossip usually ran deeper than the shelves. He asked careful questions, pretending he was simply curious about any riders passing through the night before. A few people claimed they hadn't heard much, but one older man remembered seeing someone heading toward the ridge just after dusk the day before the horse appeared. He hadn't gotten a clear look, but the riders seemed to be traveling fast, like they were trying to outrun something. That tiny bit of information pressed harder on the rancher's thoughts. If someone was rushing across his land, they were either running from danger or running toward something they couldn't delay. And the horse left in his barn proved their destination had been intentional. He returned home later than expected, mind full of scattered details. The horse greeted him with a soft nicker, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. This wasn't a simple favor. It was the beginning of something unpredictable. That night, as he prepared for bed, he heard a sound outside. A faint crack, like a foot pressing against a dry branch. His heart jumped as he moved quietly to the window. The yard looked empty, but he trusted his instincts too much to dismiss the noise. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, maybe deciding whether to reveal themselves or stay hidden. The rancher stood still, breathing evenly, listening to the distant hum of the wind. The truth hadn't surfaced yet, but the tension around the ranch was growing thicker each day. And he knew with unsettling certainty that the person who left the horse would eventually return. What he didn't know was whether they would come seeking help, or whether the danger following them would reach his doorstep first. The night after he heard that faint crack outside, he barely slept again. Every sound felt sharper, every shift of wind more suspicious. By morning he looked tired enough that even the horse in the barn lifted its head with a curious tilt as if sensing the strain in him. He fed the animal slowly, his hands steady but his thoughts racing. The mystery around this unfamiliar horse was no longer just a puzzle left on his doorstep. It was starting to feel like a shadow creeping into every corner of his life. As he stepped outside, he scanned the yard with careful eyes. The tracks from the night before were faint, barely enough to make sense of, but he noticed one thing. Someone had stood behind the old rain barrel near the barn. The dirt looked slightly shifted, the kind of mark a person might leave if they stayed still for a while. Whoever watched him hadn't come closer after that. They just waited, watched, then left without a trace. He didn't like the idea that someone felt comfortable enough to wander through his property at night. He had always relied on the quiet terrain and open land to warn him of approaching riders or visitors. Now he wasn't sure the ranch was as safe as it used to be. He saddled his mare and took a slow ride toward the south ridge, hoping to clear his thoughts. The land spread out wide beneath the bright sky, a place he had known since he was young. But today, even the openness felt tense, as if the hills and trees hid secrets waiting to break loose. He guided the Murray up a steep rise and stopped at the top, scanning the distant fields. Nothing moved except the grass swaying with the passing breeze. Still, a sense of unease pulled at him. He knew someone was out there, watching him. Watching the horse. Maybe watching the ranch for reasons he didn't understand yet. When he got back, he checked the barn again. The horse paced its stall slightly more than usual, as if it sensed something too. Horses had a way of knowing when danger hovered near. He brushed the animal's coat, thinking about the halter with the missing tag. He wondered what had been on that tag. A name, an owner, a location? Maybe something important that someone wanted erased before the horse reached his barn. He spent the afternoon repairing a loose section of fence on the west side. While hammering in the new boards, he kept glancing toward the tree line. Twice he thought he saw something move between the branches. Not an animal, something taller. More deliberate. He straightened, the hammer hanging loosely at his side. He watched for a long moment, but nothing came out. If someone stood there, they blended into the shadows well enough to be invisible. The rest of the day passed slowly. The sun dropped behind the hills, leaving the ranch dipped in gold before the evening cool settled in. He cooked himself a simple dinner but barely tasted any of it. His mind kept circling back to the horse, the note, and the tracks behind the rain barrel. When darkness fell, he kept the lamps low and sat near the window. He didn't want to draw attention with bright light. He waited, listening for movement outside. For a while the night stayed quiet, too quiet. Not even the usual rustling from the wind through the grass. Then he heard it, a faint sound near the barn, not loud. Not rushed, just a careful step on gravel. His heart kicked hard in his chest. He stayed still, watching the yard through the thin curtain. He could make out a shape near the barn doors. Someone was there, standing in the dark, possibly debating whether to enter. He moved quietly through the house, grabbed his jacket, and slipped outside through the back door. The night chilled the air, but the tension pushed away any sense of cold. He walked in a slow arc toward the barn, keeping his steps soft. As he came closer, the shape near the doors shifted, noticing him. He called out, his voice steady. He didn't want to startle whoever it was, but he wanted answers. The figure froze, then took a few steps back, moving into deeper shadow. He stepped forward cautiously, trying to see a face or get a clearer outline. But the darkness swallowed the figure entirely, giving him only a glimpse of movement before whoever it was turned and ran into the trees. He chased for several steps, but the shadows were too thick, the night too deep. The person disappeared almost instantly. He stopped near the edge of the woods, breathing hard. Whoever came wasn't ready to talk, but they were willing to come close. That meant something was pushing them toward him. Something serious. He returned to the barn and checked the horse. The animal was restless, turning in its stall, ears flicking in every direction. He spoke softly to calm it down, gently placing a hand on its neck. The horse eased slightly but didn't settle fully. It felt the tension outside too. He stayed in the barn for a long time, waiting to see if the visitor would come back. But the rest of the night stayed silent again. Before heading back inside, he noticed something on the ground near the stall door. A scrap of cloth, torn and worn along the edges. He picked it up and turned it over in the dim lantern light. It wasn't his. Someone dropped it during their visit. Someone close enough to touch the barn door. The next morning, he examined the cloth more carefully. It looked like a piece from a well-used coat, maybe something a traveler would wear on long roads. The fabric carried dust, but also a faint smell of smoke, like someone had been near a campfire recently. He tucked it into his pocket, knowing it might matter later. Throughout the day, small things began to bother him. The horse seemed more alert than usual, staring at the barn entrance as if expecting something to happen. The dogs at the nearby ranch, the same ones restless the night before the horse arrived, barked again when the wind shifted toward the ridge. And birds that normally nested in the tall oak near his fence took flight suddenly, scattering in all directions. By midday, he had the uneasy feeling that someone was watching him again, not from far, from somewhere close. He walked the property line, checking the fence posts out of habit, but his eyes kept drifting toward the woods. Every few minutes he thought he saw a flash of movement, a shadow slipping between trees, a figure ducking behind a trunk. But when he looked directly, nothing remained except the shifting branches. When he checked the barn later, something new caught his attention. The horse's mane had been touched, just slightly. Not brushed, not cleaned, but moved in a way that suggested someone had placed a hand there. Someone familiar to the horse. He stepped back, feeling a chill crawl along his spine. The visitor from last night hadn't just stood near the barn. They had gotten close enough to reach inside. Maybe they came to make sure the horse was still there. Maybe they came to see if they could take it back. Or maybe they were too afraid to reveal themselves fully. As the day stretched toward dusk, the sky darkened under thick clouds. The ranch looked more closed in than usual, the shadows heavier. He walked toward the house, but halfway there he stopped, realizing something important. The mystery wasn't just creeping closer. It was circling him, tightening. Someone wanted him involved whether he asked for it or not. He thought about the note again. The words about danger being near. He thought about the rider seen rushing across the ridge, the restless dogs, the tracks, the figure in the night. All of it formed a web around him. And at the center stood the horse that was delivered to his barn with no warning and no explanation. As thunder rumbled low in the distance, he knew something was coming, something big, something that would force the truth out into the open. Whatever this danger was, it was no longer far away. It was already here, closing in with every passing hour. The sheriff's voice still echoed faintly in the barn when everything finally went quiet. The stranger's message, the hidden trail in the hills, the chase through the dark fields, and the tense standoff under the broken windmill had led to a truth heavier than the rancher ever expected. Now, standing beside the unfamiliar horse that had started all of this, he felt a strange mixture of relief and weight settle in his chest. The horse shifted its hooves and let out a soft breath, almost as if it had been carrying the story just as much as he had. He reached up and ran a hand along its neck, feeling its warmth and the steady rhythm beneath its coat. For the first time since finding that note in the stall, he felt like he could breathe fully again. The sheriff walked back from the old windmill site with a calmer step. The man they had confronted out there had finally spoken the truth about why he'd left the horse in the barn. He wasn't trying to steal anything or cause harm. He had been running from trouble he created elsewhere, and this horse had been his only chance to escape a group that wanted revenge. When he realized he was leading danger straight toward an innocent ranch, he panicked, left the horse behind with the note, and tried to handle things alone. That choice had spiraled into nights of fear and confusion, but now at least the motives were on the table. As the sheriff explained it all again, the rancher felt some of the tension uncoil inside him. Still, there were questions. A few of them sat in the air like dust that hadn't settled yet. He walked the sheriff through the barn, pointing out where the stranger had patched that loose board, where the unfamiliar horse had kicked at the stall door, and where he'd first seen that folded piece of paper tucked under the latch. The horse snorted and leaned its head against his shoulder as if deciding it was safe now. The sheriff nodded slowly, taking in each detail the same way he examined tracks in the sand. He said the stranger would be questioned fully, but nothing pointed toward a threat to the ranch anymore. It was a complicated situation, but not a malicious one. When the sheriff finally drove away, the rancher stayed outside for a long time. The night breeze carried the smell of dry soil and distant pine. The sun had set behind the hills, leaving a soft band of fading color across the sky. He thought about how quickly a quiet life could swing into danger, how a single unexpected moment could shift the ground under your feet. He'd spent years working these fields, raising cattle, repairing fences, and living with a sense of steady routine. Then suddenly, a horse he had never seen before and a note written by a man in hiding had pulled him into someone else's conflict. It was strange how life could work like that, pulling one person into another's trouble without warning. He led the unfamiliar horse to the pasture gate and paused. The horse looked back at him with eyes that carried tiredness but also trust. Something about that gaze felt like it was asking what happened next. The rancher didn't have a clear answer yet. He untied the rope and let the horse step into the open field. Instead of running, it stayed close, walking beside him like it had already chosen the ranch as its home. He wasn't sure if he'd keep it for good or return it once the investigation finished, but for now, having it there brought a sense of comfort he couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, the ranch slowly settled back into its usual rhythm. The cattle still moved with the early breeze. The water troughs still needed filling. The fences still needed checking, but something in the rancher had shifted. He found himself thinking about the stranger's past, the choices that pushed him into a desperate escape, and how fear could make a person do things they didn't plan. The rancher didn't excuse what the man had done, but he understood it a little better now. Understanding didn't erase the trouble, but it helped rebuild the calm. The unfamiliar horse began to follow him more closely, trotting behind him during morning rounds. He discovered a small scar along its shoulder, a mark that looked old and earned through hardship. It reminded him that the horse had lived through its own battles long before arriving in his barn. He brushed it down every evening, talking quietly while the sky darkened. Sometimes he talked about the land. Other times about how strange the past days had been. The horse didn't answer, but the steady sound of its breathing was enough. A week later the sheriff returned, this time with less urgency in his posture. He said the stranger had agreed to take responsibility for his actions and face whatever came next. He had requested one thing, though. He wanted the rancher to know he was grateful. Not for being caught, but for not treating him like a threat before knowing the truth. Sometimes, the sheriff explained, the way a person reacts to fear becomes a turning point. The rancher nodded, unsure what to say, but the words settled somewhere inside him. When the sheriff left again, the rancher stood at the barn door for a long moment. The horse nudged his arm, and he rested a hand on its neck. He knew now that he would keep it. Not because it was left behind, not because the stranger had no way to reclaim it, but because it somehow felt like the ranch had been missing something before it arrived. This horse had brought danger, mystery, and long nights filled with questions, but it also brought a reminder of resilience and trust. That mattered more than anything. As the days passed, neighbors asked about the horse and the story behind it. The rancher gave simple answers. He didn't share the complicated details or the fear that had lingered during those tense hours. Instead, he focused on what truly mattered. A lost animal had found its way to safety. A man in trouble had been stopped before things grew worse. The ranch had weathered something unexpected and come out stronger. One evening, while walking along the pasture fence, the rancher noticed how quiet the world felt again. The grass rustled softly. The familiar horse walked beside him, steady and calm. The air held that peaceful tone he remembered from before the barn mystery began. It wasn't that life had gone back to normal. It was that life had found a new balance. He felt grateful for that. The land had a way of teaching lessons without saying a word. Sometimes the lessons were hard. Sometimes they were gentle. This one felt like both. Standing near the barn, he looked toward the hills where everything had come to a head. He thought about how close he had come to danger and how easily things could have ended differently. But the important part was that the truth came out, no one was hurt, and the ranch was still standing strong. He took a slow breath, letting the air settle in his chest, and felt the weight finally drift away. The horse lowered its head beside him, as if acknowledging the long journey they had both crossed. The rancher smiled lightly. He had no interest in chasing trouble or getting caught up in another person's battles again. But he was glad he had seen this through. It reminded him that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and steady, the kind that shows up in the middle of an ordinary day when things suddenly shift. As the sun dipped low and the sky softened into its evening colors, the rancher closed the barn door and walked back toward the house. The familiar horse stayed outside, watching him with calm eyes, comfortable in a place that finally felt like home. The rancher glanced back once more, feeling a small but real sense of peace settle inside him. The story that had begun with a mysterious horse and a stall door note had finally reached its end, leaving behind lessons about trust, understanding, and the unexpected ways life could bring new meaning to a quiet place. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, and felt the calm evening air wash over him. Whatever came next, he knew he would face it with the same steady resolve that carried him through this strange chapter. The ranch was quiet again, but in a way that felt richer than before. And as he looked across the open land, he understood why the story had unfolded the way it did. Some things come into your life to shake it, but others come to strengthen it. This horse, in its own quiet way, had done both.